This is the first of two recordings that will review some of the changes in the August 1st, 2016 release of the Iowa Special Education Procedures document. What you're looking at on the screen right now is www.iowaideainfo.org, the website that hosts the procedures documents, and I'm showing you the section where these are posted. And so as you look down here, you'll see the Special Education Procedures. This is a very large document that we're recommending that everyone download to their computers, delete older versions of the procedures to make sure you have the current one. So that document can be downloaded easily. You can always access it here on Iowa IDA Info, but things tend to run more quickly and you can locate things a little bit more easily if you have it downloaded to your desktop. Also important, and we'll be looking at this during the video, are the release notes. This is a fairly brief document, and what it gives you is just a kind of a concise summary of some of the changes and wording and procedures that have happened in this latest August version, and there's some other documents as well. Now I've cut to a screen where you can see the actual state procedures document, which I've pulled up here. This is what, again, we're recommending that you download to your computer, and it's a large searchable document, and you can see it is dated August 1st, 2016 is the new version. What I wanted to point out is how easily searchable this is. I'd like to remind folks of that. Some people will print this out, but kind of discourage that because this document is updated regularly and changed, and so most often twice a year this will be updated, and so then page numbers will vary and things like that. So encouraging people to really explore how well you can use this in an electronic format. So you can see here, if I click on the table of contents, we get something like this, and for each section you can go directly to that section, or you can go to a detail section. So this takes me to a more detailed breakdown of the section that I chose, which happens to be Childfind. And if you'll notice here, each of these, while they don't look like they're hot links, they actually are linked. And so if I click on a particular topic, it will take me right there. Now I'm showing you a broader view of this document, including some of the tools in this document that can be used through the PDF. One thing that I wanted to show you, again, we just got through looking at the table of contents, but if you look up here and you see a magnifying glass, this is a very easily searchable document. If I click on that, we get a pop-up button here. We can type anything we want in there to search for, but if I type in prior written notice, for example, and I click next, it's going to search for whatever key phrase we put in there, and we keep clicking next. It will take me to different occurrences of that particular phrase. So it's another way to be able to find things that you're needing to locate. One final thing as far as navigation that I'll point out before we move on to the new content discussion. If I go back to the table of contents, I want to remind those watching this video is the manual does go chapter by chapter for different sections of the IEP IDA process. But as I scroll down here, I did want to point out there are several appendices at the end here, A through E. One of particular importance is Appendix A, Documentation Guide. So if I go to the detail there, this is giving me a format of essentially a page-by-page view of IEP document pages and other documents that go along with the IEP process. So as we look through this here, you can see the different documents and even the IEP pages themselves. And the format of this, if I click on one, for example, here's, if I say page B, ages 13 through 21, it will take me literally to a picture of the IEP page, and embedded in that are hot links where I can click on the blue links here, and that will take me to helpful guidance. So again, just pointing out one of the really useful features of this manual. Now we're looking at the release notes, and again, this is the very short version that highlights the changes in this August 2016 release. It's about 14 pages of notes essentially, and so we're going to use this for most of this video presentation just to kind of do a walkthrough of some of the changes. And as you look at the topics here, there is a fairly substantial number of items that have wording changes and other shifts in the Childfind section. This video, this first of 2 videos, is going to focus specifically on those Childfind changes. Some of those have to do with wording and interpretation when going through the disability suspect process. So we'll do that first, and then in the second video we'll talk about several other miscellaneous items that have changes, and you can see in the release notes they're listed kind of in order here, and we'll get to those in the second video. But let's jump in now and talk more about some of the changes in the manual in regards to Childfind and suspecting disabilities. We're now looking at page 3 of the release notes, and it may actually be helpful if you're working through this presentation. You may want to print the release notes. They're about 14 pages, so you're welcome to do that if that helps you to follow along a little bit better. But on page 3 here, the first discussion point is comparing language on team membership for disability suspect and comparing that to the new language in the current version here. So if we look at the top here, we say in the old version, 2015, you can see the description in the manual talked about just pretty generally, team membership for completing disability suspect form included, at a minimum, a representative of the LEA and the AEA who have direct knowledge of the child or the interpretation of performance data. So we already knew that both LEA and AEA were to have involvement in that process. But if we look at some of the new language that's been added, clarifications really, you can see this has just been a little bit more detail has been added. Again, it's emphasizing an AA representative and someone from LEA should be involved in the decision making. Broaden a little bit there. The team must include personnel who understand the rules of eligibility under IDEA, someone who understands Iowa law and the special education eligibility process and the evaluation standards, and also personnel who have a direct knowledge of the child and the ability to interpret performance data. So you can kind of see between an AA and LEA rep, often those roles are going to be fulfilled, but it's a reminder that those that compose the team should have those skills. There is a good clarification there for preschool. If a child is in preschool or Head Start or other setting that's similar to that, a representative from the agency who has knowledge of the child could be considered a representative from the LEA. So in those preschool settings that may not be district run, if there's a disability suspect process going on. And in some cases there's just clarification if, for example, the AA is doing an evaluation or a suspecting disability for a young child who is served at home, who is not in a preschool program. In those cases, the LEA may not apply. And note here, there's a please note section that talks about parents in the process. And you can see there's an assumption there that when this disability suspect process is occurring, that the AA, LEA are engaged in ongoing communication with the parents. So there is that assumption that there's already been ongoing sharing of information, getting information from parents, involving them. But it does mention parent participation is strongly encouraged in the specific act of determining whether disability is suspected, but is not required. Now we know, of course, that if a disability suspect goes on to a evaluation, we of course get parent consent. So this is just mentioning that actively involving parents in the suspicion process is encouraged but is not required. So a parent is not a required team member for the disability suspect form. Lastly, in this section, notice what it says here. A meeting is one means of sharing information and determining if a disability is suspected, but a meeting is not required for this process. So unlike an IEP meeting that has very specific roles and is a physical meeting of those involved in the team, the disability suspect process often is done that way, but a meeting per se is not required. Now if we scroll down, I want to point out for each of these sections of the release notes that talk about some language changes for Childfind and disability suspect, there's a rationale. And so in other words, there's a little bit of information that says why was this change made, For the most part, it's so that the process is more congruent with Iowa code, with IDEA, and also I wanted to point out in several sections here it's going to mention 2005 Special Education Eligibility and Evaluation Standards. This is a document that the Department of Education put together and approved in April of 2015. There were some draft standards before that, but these are standards that are to guide the quality of our evaluation process in special education. And so with some additional interpretations looking at that document, we've seen some of these slight changes in wording in the Disability Suspect form. I'll just briefly pull up the Special Education Eligibility and Evaluation Standards. This document is posted on the Iowa Department of Education website. Many of you are accessing this video through a blog post, and we've put the link in that post as well. But just wanted to point out that this document is out there, and the procedures in Iowa in regards to Childfind and Disability Suspect have been altered slightly, or the form or some of the wording has been altered in some cases to more accurately represent these standards. So this is a document that you may wish to take a look at, and it goes through a number of standards and explains why they're important in evaluation and assessment in special education. So I just want you to be aware that this document was kind of a guiding force in a few of these changes. So again, as you glance through the release notes, you'll see these little rationale sections, and they'll often refer to the standards document and Iowa code in some cases, pointing out that a change may have been made so that the process is more congruent with these guiding principles. So you can see here Iowa code is clear of the AA having a very strong role in the Childfind process, leadership in that area, making sure that those with disabilities and in need of special education are identified, located, and evaluated. And also, it's just pointing out that the LEA is very much needed as part of the evaluation process, because if you were to look into the standards for evaluation, there's very much an emphasis on multiple sources of information, and we know, of course, the LEA is going to be the provider of much of that data. Moving along in the release notes, this next page, this is page 4. We're kind of plugging away through some of these. Again, going back to the Special Education Eligibility and Evaluation Standards, it mentions 3 areas as the most common ways in which a public agency would suspect a disability when that suspicion would be triggered. And you can see those listed there on screen. Number 1 would be a child has a diagnosis of one of the IDEA listed conditions that has a discernible effect on one of the performance domains. Number 2, a child is not meeting standards and is unique when compared to peers. And number 3, a child is not meeting standards and has received high-quality supplemental instruction. In addition, the Iowa Administrative Rules state, you can see that note here, if interventions are demonstrated to be effective but require continued and substantial effort that may include the provision of special education, the agency shall then conduct a full and individual evaluation. So those were, thinking about those areas, we're going to keep going here, and we're going to look at the way some of the language on these suspicion of disability questions have changed and some of the rationale. In this next section, you can look at some of the 2016 language. Again, this is going to really continue to be an area that we'll look at for suspecting disabilities. If the child has a diagnosis or condition that is specifically listed in IDEA's categories. You can see those there. Those things are familiar to most of us reading this. While we have a non-categorical system in Iowa, the idea is that we're capturing these IDEA categories through our process. And so one change here, and again it's just a language change, you can see the bullet here, the condition has a discernible adverse effect on educational performance. Notice that word adverse effect is removed there. If we scroll down here to some of the rationale. You can see the comment there. An adverse effect is an eligibility conclusion, not a conclusion that is necessary when considering suspicion, and so the word adverse has been removed from the manual and from the text. So when we would get to the point of conducting the evaluation, certainly we would be looking at whether or not a condition adversely affects educational performance. But the point here is, at that point of suspicion, the bar is low, and so that word adversely affects has been removed from the disability suspect form language. Moving on to page 5 of the release notes, you can see on screen here a 2005 language and 2006 language on this next question that has been part of the disability suspect process, and how some things have changed here. If you look up in 2015, we see, let's look at this. It said in 2015, a disability is suspected, triggering the need for a full and individual initial evaluation when there are data to suggest that a child has received high-quality instruction, including universal instruction, and when appropriate, targeted or intensive interventions, and the child's performance is not meeting standards and is not progressing towards meeting standards, and is unique when compared to peers, and cannot be explained by other more plausible factors than a suspected disability. If you look at the new language, you can see that that's been trimmed a little bit. Notice the first bullet here is not meeting standards. Notice the phrase not progressing towards meeting standards is not appearing there. If you glance down in your release notes towards the rationale, it does mention, so the reasoning behind this change, it talks about that the eligibility standards again for this pathway of suspecting disability does not talk about progress towards the standard. If a learner must be discrepant from standards, not progressing towards standards, and be unique, the bar to suspecting a disability is too high. So that progress phrase was intentionally omitted for this reason. And they give an example, and I can scroll down here. Some of you may be following along here, but I've jumped down to the rationale here. And so they do give an example. If we consider, for example, a student who had been homeschooled, once the learner begins to attend school, perhaps they begin to make progress, but remain discrepant from standards and unique from peers. Given the previous requirement for this pathway, it's pointed out that we could err in not suspecting a disability, while the deficit could be partially due to lack of appropriate instruction and partially due to a disability. So again, there is this idea of the bar being lower for suspecting disability. So there was that change. Then we continue to have the uniqueness bullet in the 2016. But if you look, the third bullet, cannot be explained by other more plausible factors, has been removed down here. And if you look down on the rationale, the main reasoning for that is neither the interim standards or the 2015 eligibility standards really talked about that concept of cannot be explained by other more plausible factors, so that was removed as well. Now, one last thing I want to point out here, old language, 2015, new language. In the old language, you can see up here there is discussion about high quality instruction. Down here, removed is a reference to high quality instruction. Now, procedures had taken that concept and elaborated that it included universal instruction and, when appropriate, targeted or intensive interventions. The language there could lead one to believe that a certain level of intervention was necessary before suspicion was reasonable, and that's not the case, because we know that we can't, there's sometimes reasons where we do suspect a disability and we've not had a certain level of intervention, and then sometimes post-consent we have to incorporate those interventions, but again we have to make sure that we have a fairly low bar for suspicion of disability. So in this item, that reference to high quality instruction has been taken out. Moving on to page 6 of the release notes, and notice here this next one has been fleshed out, and there's not a direct comparison in the 2015 disability suspect form, but let's take a look at this one. A disability is suspected, triggering the need for full and individual evaluation when there are data to suggest that the child has received high-quality instruction. Now here we are saying general instruction plus evidence-based supplemental instruction, and the child is not meeting standards and is not progressing towards meeting standards. So while we just got through saying there's not a mandate for a certain amount of intervention before we suspect disabilities, notice down here in the rationale, and this is referencing again the eligibility standards, gives the reason why we will sometimes consider this. A public agency suspects the child might have a disability if, as part of the school's general program, it has provided the child with general instruction plus evidence-based supplemental instruction with sufficient frequency and duration, and has an agency-determined number of consecutive data points below a goal line that represents the performance needed to improve the level that would allow the child to successfully access and perform in the general curriculum. Sufficient frequency and duration is individually determined based on the intervention provided and the needs of the child. Intervention should be designed so that a reasonable professional would expect that a child without a disability would make progress with supplemental instruction. So we think about in general education we are supposed to be providing research-based interventions for students who are struggling, and that's happening for many of our students. Think of the I'm thinking particularly for our K-3 students in Eli for literacy. By law, we know that if there's screening going on and when students are not meeting benchmark, interventions are mandated. So when we look at this item here, sometimes we do have students that are getting quality instruction plus supplemental instruction, and we're still not meeting standards, and in some of those cases there would be a time when a team may suspect a disability. So again, emphasizing that there's not a mandated blank number of weeks of intervention required at all, because sometimes, as mentioned in the last item, there's different reasons why we're suspecting disability. But for some of our students that are getting high quality interventions, there would be a time and point that a team may suspect a disability as well. And finally, this is page 7 of the release notes, our last item, and again we're kind of comparing 2015 language and the new 2016 language. You can see in 2015, you can see how this is written. Sometimes we would suspect a disability if a student is meeting standards or progressing, but they may require ongoing and substantial resources to continue that progress. Now, the changes in wording here are essentially for clarity, and the rationale just simply says here there's a closer parallel to the rules language than in the current procedures. So the language is improved for clarity in this case. So in our current statement here, we may suspect when there's data to suggest that child has received high quality instruction, and we're thinking gen ed instruction plus supplemental, and is meeting standards or is progressing, but requires continued and substantial effort that may include the provision of special education and related services. So sometimes that is a consideration and suspicion, and ultimately when we look at eligibility. Perhaps the student is progressing, but possibly the level of intervention required is very substantial. It may be beyond the capacity of general education, and there may be a need for special education. So in some cases, this would be a reason why we would suspect a disability. So on page 8 of the release notes, you just simply have kind of summarizing everything that was in the previous discussion. There are now four questions or considerations on the disability suspect form, whereas there were previously 3. And they're just showing these here on the release notes. You can look at these. So this is not new information. This is just summarizing what we just talked through in the previous pages. So if a team, AA, LEA team, were to answer yes to any of these, we would then suspect a disability. The form in WebIEP has already been updated to reflect these modified new questions, so people going in now will see that change. It was actually implemented as of August 15th, so those questions are in there. So as teams start to think about these changes in the language, another resource, what I'm showing you right now, this is just showing in Appendix A of the Large Procedures Manual that kind of gives us a form-by-form view. You can see I pulled out the disability suspected form, and again these new questions, 4 of them now, are shown here. And again, just a reminder that anything in blue is a hot link, so it's a good resource for teams if they're kind of reviewing the questions here. If I click on, for example, diagnosis of a condition, it takes me to guidance, and that reminds me of those IDA categories and so forth. So that is a resource for teams as well, the Appendix A of the large manual. So this concludes the first of our 2 videos. Again, in the first video we wanted to spend time talking specifically about the Childfind disability suspect topics, and in the second video we'll talk about a number of other changes. Again, I'm showing the screenshot here of the iowaidainfo.org site. Just strongly encourage everybody to go there, get the newest manual, download that to your computer, remove old copies, and again the release notes are there as well. Thanks for listening in, and we'll continue this discussion on the second video.